The processes of socio-cultural and spiritual refinement, change, accumulation and complication are never completed while we are alive. They are driven by the value orientations of our communication, mediated and immediate, indirect and direct, at all levels of communications in civilizations, from reading to conversations, as sharing and affirming our relationship with ourselves, with others and with the world. In this respect, our culture is the dynamic living environment of connection with everyone and everything, in which our values are daily recoded, reinterpreted, renewed and exchanged. This is also done through any visible or invisible form of communication with a cultural context, from the story told and the amusing joke to the shared smile, meaningful look, touch, hug or kiss, from talking to yourself to admiring the sunset over a beautiful landscape, from tears of sadness or delight to the shared silence and sense of default when words are superfluous. Such communication, or communion, which does not aim at the transmission of information, but at the confirmation of interpersonal relationships in our culture through joint empathy, for example, of joy and satisfaction with life, is often carried out through direct contact, unmediated, immediate, including purely physical, like the hug, the kiss, the touch, or the contagious laugh. Sometimes this happens without specific signs, with ambiguous silence or only by contextual implication. And sometimes it also happens through meaningful direct actions connections, defined by Carl Jung as living symbols, para, and meta-meaning evaluative game gestures, symbols of connecting self-expression without an equivalent outside the human world, for example, a wink, an exclamation, mimicry, nodding, bowing, sign of the cross, or clapping, conveying directly from person to person ideas, concepts, feelings, values, experiences, and meaning, characteristic of an existing. Not outside the human soul, but solely and only within the spiritual and soul-cultural world of humans, Jung 2005. Psychic life through communion concentrates, releases, or reproduces psychic energy. It is both purely physical, biocurrents from electrolysis of anions and cations, and bodily biochemical, production of hormones as a result of selective valuable, mental and spiritual, socio-cultural mental stimuli, and behavioral, biological and bioecological, following innate functional patterns passed down from generation to generation. In their personal development as social creatures, human beings receive, release and transmit to each other also transpersonal, collective psychic energy, in their communal life. But the psychic energy of the person cultivated in soul and spirituality, simultaneously with his bodily realized naturalness, has the potential to be supernatural, superreal. It can suddenly disappear or, miraculously, appear, as if out of nowhere. And in certain, rare and sublime moments, it can also reach levels close to the unbelievable, because of dreams, because of ideals, because of love, because of living symbols in interpersonal communication, which are perceived as sacred, as supervalues based on moral, metaphysical, cultural overmeaning. However, the historicity of the proposed complex research is not the main goal. In this case, historicity can be seen rather as conditional or as symbolic, since we are not interested in exactly what happened in the past, but the question of what is left of it in the present and what it can bring us in our future. The knowledge of the mental cultural dynamics, paradoxicality and complexity of what was inherited from our ancestors also contains aspects that are relevant for the present and for our future. It enables us to take a different look at the problem of social, civilizational and communication crises. Crisis states break down the conservatism of socio-cultural systems, and the threat of catastrophe when they are in a tense state of semi-equilibrium provides an opportunity to complicate them by upgrading and structuring in an innovative way that has a chance of being more sustainable and more sophisticated than the traditional one. Communication revolutions are also due to communication crises. The collapse of human society gives rise to the need for innovations in communication and its development at a more complicated, more sophisticated and higher level. Some negative consequences of crises and revolutions can have fatal consequences, for example, mass conformity and formalism, amoralism and the transformation of man into an amorphous mass, the game of master and servant, the magic of the dream of the panacea. But the negatives can also become a prerequisite for the emergence of new forms of communication and fellowship, which build on the old ones and thus complicate and enrich them. In this context, we can understand more clearly the position of some classic authors who claim that encroachment on collective memory and on the transmission of cultural tradition is fatal for the human world.
Symbolic ecosystems and human beings. The paradox of human beings and the knowledge of it are important for understanding interpersonal communication as a community-creating, human-creating, and meaning-making exchange of values with a cultural context, affirming the individual's connections with himself, with others, and with the world. From the perspective of communication revolutions in human cultural history, it is necessary to consider how innovative forms of communication balance the original duality of personality, and how they affect the need for empathy and empathy for the enigmas and wonder of life and of human self-creation, autopoiesis. The superreality of our psychic and socio-cultural, spiritual world is the point of departure for the analysis of the nature of interpersonal communication, and the cultural changes that revolutions in communications bring about through the processes of humanization of man, which is both a project and a fact, a dream and reality, and also dream reality. Knowledge of the dangers of the simplistic elementalization of human thinking, morals, and feelings is necessary as a critical guide, so that the study of the complexity of cultures and communications is not reduced to elementary presupposed models that replace the ambiguity and heterogeneity of the truth about human reality. All this poses a significant challenge to the study of revolutions in human communication with a cultural context, to think about them in a complex and qualitative way, not only through elementary arithmetic with quantitative data, but also through living symbols that, regardless of our will, weave dense multi-layered networks of significance, meaningfulness, and moral values that function as self-contained mental and spiritual, that is, psychic and socio-cultural, symbolic meta-ecosystems in the superorganic world of cultural tradition in which and through which we live. About the living symbols through which we communicate with each other with our minds and our feelings, Jung claims that sometimes they contain such a huge and saturated collective psychic energy that they not only change our idea of reality, and from there, reality itself, but are capable of striking a person and even killing him, in the most literal physical sense. Key and interesting questions regarding the invisible to the eyes are, for example, when, how far, and to what extent is it real? Can we talk to angels and demons, and more importantly, can they talk to us, as traditional folk belief suggests? And if such conversations are possible, are they entirely imaginary and subjective, or do they have another dimension, of happening facts from an environment independent of us? Can we also talk to luck, to fate, to love, to humanity, to nature, to ideas and ideals, to our soul and spirit, to good and evil, and do they themselves speak to us in some way? Could God actually, or at least super-actually, be one of us, just a stranger at the bus stop, as Joan Osborne's famous song From the Dawn of the New Millennium goes? Is what Stephen King wrote in It, or The Dark Half, true or just fiction for the entertainment of the readers? These are some of the questions from the history of the unseen in us that this book sets out to unravel in a specific way. And all these exotic questions are related in one way or another to the main question in this book, namely, what are the qualities of humanity in the invisible symbols with which we communicate? This question implicitly includes the following sub-questions: what is humanity, what are human species qualities, and why? How do they arise in revolutions in communication, and how do they transform human individuals into human personalities? Why do they arise? Why do we need them? How and why do we need to preserve them by adapting, transforming, reinventing and reinventing them? How to have them? How to save them? The question of the crises in our communication in today's age implies another series of sub-questions, not only what is human, but also what is the inhuman that arises in our communication, what causes it? And also which of our human qualities hinder the development of our humanity and why? What do we need to seriously transform or leave in our past at all to have a chance for a future at all? The symbolic levels of superrealities in our communication work systematically independently of us and of our will. Although we are their creators, we are not their legislators. They function according to their own laws and rules, which we cannot individually influence, because they are the result of a cumulative effect of human interrelationships in their entirety and are to a significant extent independent, just like language systems. Since our values, our orientations, our desires, our dreams, our projects, our actions, our behavior depend on them, it is as important to understand how they work in relation to them as it is to understand how physics, chemistry, or the forest. We are dependent on the symbolic superrealities that define our self-consciousness without being able to command or influence them, and should be aware of, understand their nature in order to be adequate to the world in which we live. And this is precisely our human socio-cultural mentally constructed superworld. Reasoning along these lines can have diverse benefits and purposes, including educating, providing knowledge and new perspectives on knowledge, and being of interest to those interested in the issue at hand. However, the main goals are to create a general theoretical framework, which is nevertheless sufficiently well developed and illustrated with references and examples from different fields. If we underestimate the ecological aspect of the mental symbolic superrealities in our communication, we will not notice and will remain defenseless and inadequate in front of their systemic character, which unites the visible and the invisible, empiricism and symbols, their physical and supraphysical, soul, mental, bodily and supracorporeal, spiritual, socio-cultural levels. If we do not consider them ethically and philosophically, however, we will miss their value significance, their supermeaning, their level of transcendence, which defines them as existing and realizing at all, at least because they are always motivated and directed by a superlogical excess, meaning. The ecological theme often lacks humanity, transcendence, value, morality, soul and spirituality, symbolic levels, supermeaning. The philosophical lacks reality and empiricism, a connection with life as a physically realized and vital process. It lacks life, it also lacks systematicity. For the mind, it will only benefit the moral philosophical and the empirical ecological to unite as they are in reality a union in one organic and unity of body and spirit, of our physics and soul. And we can get an idea of this real, not speculative, unity by considering the problems of what exactly humanizes us as human qualities when we communicate with living symbols, how they were formed, how they transform the self-awareness and behavior of man, what direction they have taken and what possibilities for getting out of their rut, and for revolutionary transformations of man in his communication suggest. This book attempts to combine the ecological and the moral philosophical, the symbolic cultural, the imaginative and the empirical in our human superworld into a unified, unusually, quantum, eco-humanist account of the spiritual culture and moral animosity of human experience, and especially to those of them which are inaccessible to the eye, nor to the manipulation of the hand, the immaterial cultural forms of mental life. But the resulting philosophical essayist plan in the text would be useless if it remained only anchored in individual, subjective opinion and a shared moral position, or else abstractly abstracted and purely speculative as a theological treatise. For this, the text needs an empiricism, but a very specific one, the contradictory and indefinite empiricism of the quantum world, of the spiritual and soul origin in human cultures. In this number we include the facticity not only of the realized human achievements, for example, the civil airlines or the banking system, but also the actual presence of feelings, dreams, desires, i.e. of the intangible, which is actually the engine of human activity and gives rise to our every material invention or social achievement. In this sense, the empirical facts that we will explore can be both the state political structure of society and the empathy, catharsis and thoughts that a particular popular novel that has become a legend gives rise to, both revolutions in communication techniques and the emergence of connecting concepts, feelings and symbols in collective memory, in the books of famous thinkers or in works of art, in music, in dance, in theater, in poetry, in storytelling, in cinema, both the development of commercial and economic systems, and the emergence of ideas, dreams and moral compasses and ideological projects for a better and more reasonable society.
But what does human beings mean? As a guide to this key riddle for the future of our world, a look at the big question, what is man, including the questions, what should be, and what can become, asked from the perspective of the cultural context of debt and humanization historically. The tradition of our anthropogenesis has been built up, both in terms of the development of humanity, and in terms of the personal individual behavior of each individual born as a human, from every era, and above all, from our modern one. How does rethinking and reassessing our inherited local past in the historical awareness of our cultural context help us with the question of what is man? Historical awareness and cultural context in communication are largely synonymous. We can put an equal sign between them. Without historical consciousness, we do not have cultural consciousness. Without cultural consciousness, we have no human consciousness. Without human consciousness, we have no consciousness. And accordingly, with the damaged historical consciousness, our cultural consciousness is also damaged. With the damaged cultural consciousness, our human consciousness is damaged. And if our human consciousness is damaged, then our consciousness is damaged in general. The treatment of the historical, by rethinking and remaking its cultural context, is also a treatment of the cultural and the human, and of self-awareness in general, as such. And the global human crisis that we are facing at the dawn of the 21st century requires us to have awareness, to be human beings, to be cultural, and to carry in an innovative way the past of our traditions into the future of a new world that is just beginning, which depends on each one of us. The communication revolution of education gives birth to the invisible world of human language and our human psyche. Without education, man would be a speechless being without mental life. The communication revolution of folklore builds the invisible world of commonly understood aesthetic and ethical moral value, shared human feelings, without which no human being can fully communicate with others. The communication revolution of literature gives rise to the superreality of statehood and civilizations, of the public good and of civilization. Without it, every human community would become a tribe of barbarians and savages. The communication revolution of print media gave birth to nations, mass education, common culture and awareness, and ideological self-awareness. Without the skills to use the public media, people would become a crowd without self-awareness and without convictions, without opinion and without political culture, slaves to their passions and outright lies, unconscious victims of political and social manipulations. The communication revolution of social networks expands the anthroposphere to a global super ecosystem, which has become one of the main factors for the quality of life on our planet. Without our connectedness to other people on the planet in shared common human causes for the survival of life and for respect for the human dignity of each, we human beings could easily become fanatical ideologues, isolationist nationalists, or immoral technocrats who they follow orders without evaluating them and without thinking. This would repeat the rise of the banality of evil that led to the 2 world wars, but possibly in even sharper catastrophic proportions. What are the aims of a study of the invisible in our cultural heritage, and what are the tasks of analysis set in such a perspective? The goals are to understand what humanized us, and how, in the historical development of the revolutionary changes of human society with a cultural context. It should serve as a criterion for taking stock of what we need to preserve, what to adapt and what to give up in order to continue to be human after the 21st century. In times of crisis, we have to give up something inherited, other legacies we have to rethink, recreate and readapt them to the new environment and situation, and others we have to preserve at all costs. It is important to take stock. And this also means a reassessment, rethinking what is what in the unfulfilled plans, processes, and dreams for our future inherited from the historical past. What in these surreal half-dreams, half-facts is dangerous, problematic, vital, life-saving, humanizing, or a value we can't live without? What is human essential from their invisible context of cultural heritage in communication? What is valuable and what is not, and why? What we can and can't do without, and why? We need this account of the past not so much because of what has ended historically, but rather because of what does not end, has not yet ended and must not end in the future. The digging of knowledge about the past aimed at our future, or about the future of our past, is necessary in order to be able to face the challenges of the present with a clearer view, with vision, so that we do not lose our horizons and to continue to develop in the extraordinary situation of the Earth common home, in which we find ourselves, including so that we can create unprecedented innovations, for the future of our future. Examining the humanizing consequences of the revolutions in communication in historical terms, rethought through the Balkan view, have for their main purpose just such an assessment of the future of our past with a view to the future of our future, read through the questions posed in the Southeastern European cultural context. What do we has been humanized until now, what problems and perspectives it gives us, what of it will be appropriate to keep for our future and why? By the way, more than one or two such assessments have been made so far in works that have become classics dealing with the history of civilizations, starting with Spengler's The Sunset of the West. The special thing about this one is, first, that it is a Southeastern European perspective of thinking about the common human. And secondly, that it is focused on a very unusual object-neo-object, the invisible cultural heritage, that is, those humanizing and anthropomorphing us independently system-working symbolic superrealities that are not fully realized, which are still only a dream, a project barely begun, or else an incomplete process, an unfinished, or not quite finished, undertaking. In other words, what is special about this analysis will also be the study of dreams that make us human, of those that are just fantasies, but also of those that are in the process of being realized, somewhat completed, but not finally, or just now started to develop, almost happened, but not quite.